Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. Hello. Today, I want to talk about teaching, and hopefully the title of the talk helps you to understand the ways in which I want to talk about teaching, and hopefully the ideas that I'm going to share aren't new, especially for the minds in this space. So my talk is entitled Critical Eyes, Pedagogy as Risk in the Sport, Media, Equity Classroom. When asked to contribute to conversation around the themes for this conference, I thought about how often I have had the opportunity to talk about teaching. That being teaching in the physical space or the virtual space of the undergraduate classroom, or in the mentorship process associated with the supervision of graduate students. Though I speak very informally, quite often, with colleagues about teaching, the most recent formal conversations about inclusive pedagogy that I've been a part of stem from figuring out how to design classes for emergency remote delivery, all right, to deal with the constraints and the realities of the COVID-19 pandemic. But in preparing for this talk, I came to a major conclusion, that being there are few opportunities to talk about teaching in a critical sense, and all of its tensions, complexities, trauma-laden passages, and yes, rewards as well. So teaching that is more than just something we get through in order to have more time for research, or teaching that we try to reduce as soon as perhaps we have funding for a project, and I am guilty of that as well. So my point here is that other experiences and journeys in our scholarly world often come at the expense of teaching and the constant and necessary reflexivity required for sustaining equity, inclusion, and social justice work in the classroom. So today I want to focus on the risks associated with a critical pedagogy in the classroom. And to me, critical pedagogy includes the awareness that positionality, subjectivity, traumas, lived experiences inside and outside of the academy, intersectional realities, among other things, are always present and intensified in the classroom. These risky elements are parts of the everyday classroom, regardless of the subject matter of the course, even if the course is unrelated to the lived realities of oppressed and equity-seeking groups. So in this talk, I will share some reflections on how pedagogical risks enter into the conversation in the subject areas that I've taught in, such as the sociology of sport, media and inequality, diversity and equity, popular culture, as well as how these research findings from a 2014 collaborative study that I did that Joe cited in the introduction still haunt me and force me to reflect on the pedagogical risks that are necessary in the classroom space. All of these reflections are grounded in the second broad theme of this year's conference, education and learning in worlds of differences. And this theme also makes me think about the many ways that difference can be seen in the classroom, in the students, in the subject matter, and definitely via the bodies of those who teach. So what is pedagogical risk and why am I talking about it today? Before I share these reflections with you, it's important to obviously get on the same page. Often, I think risk is talked about in terms of adverse or unwanted outcomes. Our relationship to risk is often painted or described in very reactionary terms, right? So risk is something to fear, to plan for, to be prepared for. Risk is sometimes the unknown, and yes, sometimes the predictable. These are some of the perspectives of risk that we know of from Beck's work on risk society and Lupton's work in the book Risk. I want to talk about risk as something that is embodied. What I mean here is that the bodies in front of the classroom are risky. And what I mean here is based on how they look, their gender, sexuality, abilities, race, religion, or perceived gender, sexuality, abilities, race, religion, etc. Student bodies can also be described as embodying risk based on these same markers of difference that I've just described. Certain subject matters are also risky, talking about racism, sexism, transphobia, homophobia, Islamophobia, race, whiteness, white supremacy. These things are very risky in a classroom space. And I would add too, for those of us who are coming from spaces that are more corporate or other work environments, these subject matters are risky in those places as well. So in these cases, risk is ever present in the learning space, in the bodies in front of the classroom, those in the seats, and of course in the subject matter. So often, difference is most evident and grappled with in those classroom spaces that are seemingly benign, yes, or apolitical, whatever that means. And I'm talking here about classrooms that seem free of politics because they do not focus on the social inequalities or oppression explicitly so. Usually, it's in those spaces where politics is most present and operative, and where an anti-oppression lens and culture is challenging to cultivate. So for me, pedagogy and risk go hand in hand, because I cannot separate my lived experiences inside and outside of the academy from what and how I teach. And I also recognize that this is the same for students, no matter the myriad identity markers they bring to the learning space. And this is sort of where I'd like to start talking about some of these reflections, talking about spaces. So in reflection one that I've entitled Safe Spaces, for whom? The subtitle is, You're Not Black, You're African American, and I'll explain. So here's a pedagogical reflection for you. This reflection comes from 2006. When teaching on the subject of Canadian media and representation, I facilitated a discussion on the intersections of race and gender when thinking about representation in front of and behind the camera. I was talking about my lived experiences of being in graduate courses on media and decoding news on crime, and what it was like to do so in a small group setting where I was not only the only Black student, but the only racialized student in the course. So in front of this class, about 100 students, I identified myself as a Black person, something that I thought was obvious and therefore pretty benign to affirm, and was immediately cut off by a student sitting in the front row, mid-sentence. A student who I was told by colleagues in the department was the brightest in the cohort. This student cut me off and said, "You're not Black, you're African American." So in our work, we likely speak about safe spaces. We make claims about offering them, and even have discussions at the outset of a course or event, asking folks to contribute to a framework of what makes a space safe. Perhaps like me, you've wondered who speaks and doesn't speak in this safe space. When we create a classroom safe space agreement or code, who are these rules for? How do we know classroom safe space agreements work? Who evaluates their efficacy, and how? Such agreements are thought to be proactive and necessary in staving off the risks associated with difficult knowledges and realities, staving off the risks and traumas or harms and tensions and oppressions that obviously ensue in the space. Do they truly protect students, these safe space agreements, especially those from oppressed groups? When and where does the protection of the instructor come into play? So in other words, who are these agreements really for? So scholars like Sensoy and D'Angelo, Araro and Clemens remind us that spaces can never be completely safe. Redmond says, safe spaces? Forget about them. Yes? Maybe we should talk about committing to the work of making spaces safer. Some like to talk about brave spaces, where we accept that meaningful social justice work disrupts and causes discomfort. But let's also talk about a pedagogy of discomfort that acknowledges the place of emotions in teaching and in learning. Let's embrace the discomfort, as Bowler insists we should. But let's also trouble or begin with unpacking the premise that objectivity is devoid of power or positionality. Back to the reflection. So this student didn't want to see race, or at least acknowledge it, though we were speaking about race. Perhaps they thought that talking about skin color was racist. I don't know, I never asked. I shared this experience with you not to engage in a how to respond dialogue or unpacking of how I did respond to the student, but rather as an example of the challenges with diversity and inclusion work in the classroom. I also shared this experience to highlight that as instructors, we might prepare lectures and discussion session material with a pedagogical objective in mind. Material and questions are asked, and they're based on some sort of learning outcome, of course. In our training, though, it is rare that we learn the craft of managing resistance to who we are as people in the classroom. My graduate school training, and maybe you can reflect on yours as well, did not include that. Very few mock job talks prepare you for the realities of embodying risk, especially when the body is yours. Reflection 2, kind of a continuation. I call this one The Bodies We Are In. Subtitle is Professoring While Being Black and a Woman. So this reflection comes from 2001. While working as a part-time instructor and finishing up my PhD, I presented a Sociology of Sport class with a media report about Venus and Serena Williams. And at that time, a shock jock, one of these provocateurs on the radio, called Venus and Serena Williams, quote unquote, too muscular. He called them boys and called them disgusting animals who had a better chance of posing nude on the cover of National Geographic than Playboy. So the classroom discussion was about cultural and ideological racism and the representation of racialized bodies, specifically Black women in sports. In the lecture of about 130 students or so, 99.9% who identified as white, I outlined key concepts and critical scholarly takes on how the lenses of white supremacy and whiteness all too often work to annihilate and other racialized bodies. And I was told by a student sitting in the class that there was nothing racist about the comments of the radio host, all right? It was just me taking a really funny joke too seriously, and that it was easy to laugh along because the Williams sisters are quote unquote freaks who don't look like tennis players. Now, this reflection always reminds me of the burdensome dance of speaking about the social realities and implications of racism and misogyny for racialized people, and how my carefully crafted lesson plan with appropriate scholarly sources and critically curated readings on the intersections of race, sport, and gender were not enough. They were not enough because in that space, that comment articulated that I had no legitimate scholarly authority or expertise to discuss the racist discourse in the story because my identity as a Black woman rendered the knowledge biased and not factual. So when the bodies that we are in intersect with the realities of the subject matters that we teach, we all too often see how power and resistance operate. So again, the subject matter is risky, yes, but what presented the greatest danger in this particular scenario was the risk of unpacking whiteness and white supremacy while in the body I was in and still am in. So the student's comment served to disruptively silence my role in facilitating the discussion around these realities in sports culture and steer it towards a more comfortable and recognizable zone. And I will add, a 2014 collaborative project that I worked on with colleagues in the sociology department, and we've been musing about doing an updated study, a follow-up study to it, Inhabiting Critical Spaces, Teaching and Learning from the Margins, provided a lot of evidence and validation for these types of perils, the perils that are involved in teaching about race and gender in certain spaces. There are also parallel perils in teaching about these issues of diversity and difference, ability, yes? So tenured, untenured, and part-time instructors in our study shared a common understanding that taking up the topics of race, racism, and white supremacy, for instance, is fraught with danger, and it's also emotionally draining. They also spoke of the uneasiness that sometimes accompanies preparing material for classes, taking up these types of knowledges, and how doing so was like preparing for battle. Recently, a panel session organized by the Toronto Metropolitan Faculty Association, my union, faculty union here on campus, the largest one, reiterated that instructors teaching these knowledges, in particular instructors teaching about issues pertaining to ability, face high levels of harassment and resistance from students, and that for racialized instructor bodies, the theme is most dire because in terms of their course evaluations, which are these official measures of feedback, the perils of teaching in the bodies that they're in are most evident. Last reflection. I'll let you sit with this for a while. This reflection is, yes, about the social justice that I think is always possible in the classroom space. I call it media analysis as equity and social justice. And this is a cartoon panel from the comic Six Chicks that perhaps you read or have heard of, or maybe you know a little bit about this panel. So this reflection is most recent. It is based on a required reading I started using in a media analysis class in 2020, and most recently in fall 2022. In these classes, I used this text as an entry point for recognizing the importance of intersectional analysis, among other things. I also use this text as an intervention because it's from a comic strip entitled Six Chicks. The artist is a Black, queer identifying individual, and mainly because it's not from a peer-reviewed journal article or book. This text is also important because it is accessible, present in the everyday, and yes, oh, so very risky in the classroom space. So students have a lot to say when engaging with the associated articles that provide an important context for interpreting the comic. And the comic, if you don't know, was banned by some newspaper comic sections after it was published, and feedback received by these publications from readers rendered the piece offensive, racist, and expressed concern regarding the seeming trivialization of the COVID-19 pandemic and racial injustice. The Toronto Star, as well, received negative feedback after publishing the panel. I guess that would be the city's largest paper. So it's an important text to unpack because of the unofficial channel that it comes from. The message and food for thought offered in the text couldn't be found in a textbook, a peer-reviewed article, or a book in 2020. And that's a good thing because probably nobody would have read it, yes? The audience would have been too limited. Its utility, though, in unpacking white supremacy, whiteness, and the broader dimensions of systemic inequalities as everyday problems has been invaluable. So, yes, there's still resistance in the classroom to texts like these and this particular text, I notice subtle changes in the silences in the not-so-safe space, or when students look to me, all right, and the body that I'm in to unpack the message, because the body that I'm in still has to do that work, and it still is work even though students may find the text that we use more affirming. So it's still work to say, yes, I see you in the class, and understand that your lived experiences are jumping out at you on the page. Some final things to say. Today, I wanted this conversation to focus on pedagogy as risk, and use it as an opportunity to remember that equity and social justice work in the classroom can be burdensome, and it often is. I also wanted to highlight that the work of decolonizing spaces, while a collective project, heavily relies on the expertise and labor of those who live in bodies that are seen as risky. Risk is embodied, and some bodies have little choice in being read as risk or as threat to comfortable spaces where diversity, equity, and inclusion work is introduced or trying to find legitimacy. So in thinking about how risk is embodied in teaching, Ahmed also reminds me that the same is true of diversity. She is very clear in talking about this idea of embodied risk, when she considers that embodying diversity, for instance, means that in organizations such as the university and larger corporate structures and worlds and other workspaces, but embodying diversity means that those who are different or who are most explicitly perceived as different, all right, come to seemingly represent how diverse or inclusive an organization or institution really is. As she says, we symbolize the hope or promise that whiteness is being undone. One thing that I hope that some of what I've said today helps us to reflect upon is who is asked or tasked with delivering courses and material, all right, and workshops, if you will, that speak to EDI, that speak to JEDI or equity and these difficult knowledges, these anti-oppressive lenses, these anti-racist, these critical disability perspectives, to name a few. What are the responsibilities of departments and broader institutions regarding safety and supporting this work, the learning and the sustaining of the culture? These things cannot be ignored in the current context where we can witness books documenting and based on differences banned, knowledge from oppressed groups' histories and realities sanitized and vilified, and necessary lenses like, just one example, critical race theory being weaponized not only for political gain, but material harm. These things cause actual harm, lived harm, and trauma. So in our universities, corporate environments, workspaces, and other organizations, who are the diversity knowledge holders? When are they seen and unseen? Beyond the bodies that embody risk and diversity in these settings by virtue of their lived experiences and subjectivities, where else can we look to bolster and meaningfully sustain our collective inclusion and social justice projects? The answers to these questions, I think, are as important as the bodies who will engage in the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicole, for the perfect start to the session and really leading us off with some questions that we can take throughout the conference. Now, this is, what's the actual name of this thing? A catch box. So, anyone who has a question for Nicole, you're getting this very soft item thrown at you. It has a microphone in it. So, don't be intimidated. It's supposed to be enjoyable. Does anyone want to start things off with a question? Throwing this at you. Ready?
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much for your presentation. Can we go back to the cartoon?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, I identify with the woman on the right, blue eyes, yes. And I think there are many levels of interpretation here, because both are, I understand the level of presentation that the interpretation that it would have here and in the United States, etc., because of color, whatever. And I understand I can't breathe and the message and all that. I understand exactly what is happening here. I also understand the fact of the mask, not wearing a mask, etc. But the interpretation, for me, as the woman on the right, is also offensive, right? I also feel insulted, if you see what I mean. Being presented as a stupid, aggressive woman. So, I mean, there are many, many different levels of interpretation, right? And it's a fantastic cartoon. I'm certainly going to use it.
Yes, and thank you for that comment. You know, it makes me think about what Stuart Hall says about Marxism, amongst other things. There are no guarantees. So, you know, getting back to this idea of how risky it is to put something like this not only on the required reading list, but to take a very good chunk of lecture time hearing from students about how they read this is really important. So you're right. One can look at this and be offended. There are other things that I wasn't able to share in this talk, but a very interesting piece of background information with this comic is that the artist actually was quite surprised that the reaction was as it was, and that the comic panel was banned from newspapers. The artists themselves, who identifies perhaps with the person on the left-hand side of the comic, actually commented that, yes, perhaps this person on the right, you know, could be offended, might have racist ideas or completely miss the point. But the intention of the comic was to show that problems are systemic and collective ones. And that gets distilled in this one comic panel, not negating the interpretations that, of course, one can bring outside of those that the artist intended. And this is why I continue to use this comic. It is so disruptive. One of the most disruptive texts that I've grabbed a hold of, and I spend a lot of hours on YouTube and TikTok and everything like that, preparing for lectures. But this one gets students talking about these nuances that I know you're getting at here, where yes, it could be read in so many different ways. That's the reality outside of these walls, right? So how do we find a way to actually put these ideas of a fulfilling social justice into play if we can't talk about this, even though it's very risky to do so? And it's a lot of work to manage the classroom space in speaking about this one comic panel. Yes.
Thank you. It's a great thing. Yes.
Not a big toss. Thank you very much for that talk, Nicole. It was really good. Can you tell me your thoughts about the importance of looking at things through a lens of intersectionality? Because whenever I think about that, I think about things like, I mean, I'm always looking at things also through the lens of filmmaking, documentaries and all that. So like Moonlight to me was so groundbreaking because it was not only talking about race, it was also talking about orientation.
Yeah, you know, I think obviously, you know, intersectionality is a starting point. This should be sort of a base entry-level conversations, right? I think when the hard thing is, though, we don't always know who's coming into the classroom space, for instance. From day to day, I will admit my willingness to enter into certain battles when it comes to intersectional issues wanes. It can't always, but it sometimes does. I'm glad you brought up Moonlight, because we talk about Moonlight in a few of the classes that I teach, and students are very well aware of how Moonlight does a better job of possibly showing one particular person in his whole self. I think there are a few problems with wanting to always foster and push the utility of always understanding the world intersectionally. The first thing is we're always, I think, fighting against and talking against other voices that are trying to define that for us and tell us that intersectionality isn't something that is valuable, yes? It's something that possibly divides people, yes? And I will say this, that identity politics is something that we shouldn't be involved with. Identity politics is important, and all groups have identity politics. It's just that some groups' politics aren't seen as political. And this, for me, is why intersectionality is important, because we all have it, yes, but it gives us a starting point to understand that positionalities now are different. Relationships to these things that are meaningful to us in the social world, those things are different. And the most meaningful relationship, I think, is power, right? So students understand that intersectionality is important. I think that it's hard to teach classes and at least want to bring an intersectional lens into the work that you do when we're fighting not just resistance in the classroom, but in the larger sort of political sphere. So yes, intersectionality is very important. And I think, much like this comic strip, students really do latch on to its use and its presence in their lives when introduced to texts that they know and they can feel their identities affirmed in. And I think Moonlight is just one example, perhaps, of a text that might do that. Although in some of my classes, many of the students say that it's a great movie, but really does it show a lot of gay sex? So there's still things, right? When you don't have a lot of something, when you don't see yourself represented, we tend to put a lot of expectations on one particular text and film. But I think you're right, Joe. I think Moonlight definitely offered something a little bit different. And I also think that that difference, the value of that difference, is where the message came from, right? The artists behind, the producers, the writers, et cetera. Yeah.
Thank you. All right, will do. Hi, I really appreciated your presentation. I teach fully online and have been since before the pandemic, and because of the pandemic, I find more and more people are taking these pedagogical risks in a fully online space, where the embodied risk is not so much in our physical presence in the classroom in real time, but asynchronously in our text, our tone. I'm constantly policing my own language and tone in how I communicate with students and how I represent myself. And still, for some students, no matter what, fall short in that respect. So I wondered if you could speak at all to the way these pedagogical risks, what forms they take in an online space, or if others could.
The technology, it disciplines us. And it disciplines different bodies in different ways. And I think, we're still kind of grappling with this in many spaces, whether it's in the university or not. wanting to take on more hybrid work or be in person but also be online. And wow, that just intensifies everything. But the online space is very interesting. I will share with you, much like you've expressed, some of the subject matter in my courses were a little toned down. But that's not just because of the technology and the space and not being able to manage and, yes, control in ways that we can in the physical space. That was by virtue of recognizing the context in which we were living, which also makes something like this very interesting as well. So how do we do that? I think that the courses can never just be about the subject matter. And I know for many of us who teach subject matters about these things, that ups the ante. One of the strategies that I know I've used and other colleagues who also teach these types of courses used when we were in the online environment is, and asynchronous at that, is not offering full lectures. So when I say if something was recorded, it would be a 7-minute clip. And then guess what? You're not talking to anybody in a group. I've sent you off to do a reflection exercise on this 7-minute clip. And what we sort of see is that sort of consolidating that time a little bit, sometimes in some ways maybe consolidates the effects of the knowledge that we're trying to share. And that can be good or bad. That can be an invitation to learn more, to maybe review that, oh, that was so quick, let's look at it again. But what we've been finding is that maybe there's less opportunity for students or those consuming the videos to sit with that knowledge and talk back to it in ways that are destructive and oppressive and dehumanizing. But as I was saying before, and I'm getting a little bit off track here, technology really has a way of disciplining us. And I think that throughout the pandemic, the ways in which it has disciplined us is actually forcing us to really think about the things that we want to say. No matter how many statements we may put on course outlines that say you can't record or capture this lecture and put it somewhere else, there's a real danger for many of us that those clips end up on someone's social media, or what happened to a few colleagues of mine, people were watching the material who weren't in the course, and they have their own sort of destructive ways of doing it. The way that I want to answer this question or end my answer is saying that the responsibility can't always be on us. So we can always, as individual instructors, have to also manage that. There has to be a culture that recognizes what this teaching online or what this asynchronous delivery really means. It's not just something that we're doing because we can't be in person. It's more than that. And all of the things that existed in the classroom physical space get transported to that space, and in even more covert ways, because all of a sudden, I don't know what everybody else's experiences are, you're in a Zoom lecture and nobody's putting their camera on. And yeah, not everybody could or can, let's be obviously acknowledge that, but most can, but choose not to. So there's this I think there is a danger in this abyss, this anonymity, which perhaps from a student perspective might be a really good thing, which I get. Yeah, I still consider myself a student too. I can see how, yeah, just showing up with my camera on can allow me just to be there, but not be there, but just be there the way I want to be there. But the outcomes and the implications of that are very different for instructors and people who are putting on workshops, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a tough question. And I think the answers change from day to day, from subject to subject, and also based on who you might know is in the class. Yeah?
Hi, Ooh, I'm loud. I'm here with my colleague from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and we teach in a community college. And Nicola, everything that you talked about is a natural bridge to the workshop that we're going to be doing tomorrow. So we're just putting a shameless little plug for uncomfortable and courageous conversations tomorrow morning. But it's so much of what you spoke about, and something that really, really hit me, and it's very specific to the cartoon, that when we're talking about this idea of risk, and me speaking as, you know, with my instructor hat on, and knowing what my body appears to be on the outside, and yet in the ways that I identify that not everybody knows, unless you're in the know, and then you go, oh yeah, that's a queer non-binary person, but not everybody knows that. But the thing that I want to really speak to is our own relationships to the bodies and voices that we're speaking from, so that when I see a cartoon, I can see the bigger picture of the message, and that person on the right, I have not personalized, because I'm seeing what the dynamic is. That's something that is really hard to convey to students. We teach behavioral health human services, and they'll go on to be counselors, social workers. So part of the concepts that we work with are bigger concepts, and we talk about things like, do you have the bandwidth to take the entirety of that in? And I'm curious, Nicole, about if that sort of like almost objective, detached place that we can be the viewer from and not personalizing the bodies is something that you speak to.
Yeah, and I would say, while that's sort of this big question, I don't think it's possible. And I should say, well, first of all, what you were saying earlier on before about the shameless plug for the workshop, I just feel like decolonizing work must be shameless. Yes, it has to be. But in getting back to what you're saying, you know, about sort of trying to step out of, to sort of step into, you know, a role of facilitating and helping people manage the knowledge and cultivate their bandwidth for and capacity for understanding is, again, I think it changes every day. You know, when I use that text in classes or other ones, other texts for that matter, I'm never looking at it in the same way that I looked at it before. And sometimes in my quest, because yeah, we have quests as instructors, there are things that we know we want them, ideas that we know we want them to have before the class is over. I'm less bound, and I would say beholden to that, because I sometimes think that all of the learning cannot happen in the classroom. And maybe for you and your colleagues, you know, too, all of the learning and the facilitating and introduction of these ideas, the real grappling and chewing with it, that important work isn't going to happen in the workshop, right? So it might be an idea that you send off with your workshop participants and say, look, you know, we brought this up here. We know that it's disruptive. We know that it's jostling or whatever, or we know it's affirming. Part of this work, though, in this space is to not think that all the answers are going to be, you know, discussed and found in this time, yeah? And, you know, I should say, you know, with the reflections I shared and, you know, the story about, you know, Black women tennis players and being called out by a student for apparently not knowing who and what I am, you know, those things still happen. But as I'm sure many of you who may teach or you encounter people that you've met in your workspaces and in other cultures, you sometimes meet up with people again. And yeah, you learn that, maybe they still don't understand or agree with something that you showed them in class X years ago, but they're still thinking about it. And ultimately, while I think we hope that people's behaviors change so practices can change, the starting point is the thinking and the unlearning, right? And it's so very hard. But yeah, you're right. Maybe what I'm saying is let's take some of the pressure off of ourselves and support people in knowing that knowledge can be chewed on outside of the realms in which they are introduced to it.
Right. Got it. Thank you, everyone, and thank you, Nicole. My name is Michael. I also have a workshop tomorrow, but 4 of my colleagues who have just spoke, 3 of them talked about one thing that I want your advice and your experience on was the work that you showed and Moonlight, right, the movie. 3 out of the 4 colleagues talked about the experience of an artistic, creative work, which then apparently was more provocative or more memorable of all the presentation. I was wondering, in your experience teaching or learning or studies, researching all the EDI of over 20 years, what's your relationship between your work versus your use of arts or artistic experience?
Yeah.
How effective or not effective it has been, which is my workshop tomorrow.
Thank you for that question. I think immediately when you asked me about what that connection might be between, art and the creative stuff that I'm interested in and that I do, and, my approaches to what I call, it's social justice learning. I think we should feel very comfortable in saying that this is what we're about. This is what it's about. It's about social justice. I was fortunate enough, just pre-pandemic in 2018, to be recommended for an EDI inclusion training workshop. The workshop is organized by Laurier University's School of Social Work, and the training is called Walls to Bridges. And if you don't know, I think Walls to Bridges has a US iteration. I think it's called Inside and Out. It might still be called Inside Out. But the training changed everything that I do in the classroom space. And for me, teaching, I think, is a creative expression, yeah. The Walls to Bridges EDI training that I took, I don't even want to call it EDI because they wouldn't call it EDI, takes instructors and those who are interested in inclusion and social justice work in learning spaces and takes them into carceral situations where we learn from and workshops are facilitated by those who live on the inside of carceral spaces. So I spent 4 days inside of a women's correctional facility in Southern Ontario, learning about pedagogy from those who were incarcerated and living inside of the prison system. That training forced me to understand that, and I sort of knew, but the way that I knew was limited, that we bring our whole bodies to any space, in particular, the classroom space. And that training changed everything that I do in the classroom, especially when it comes to risk, because I realized that those who live on the insides of these institutions, their pedagogy cannot be removed from their bodies because their bodies are immovable. They're not going anywhere. So the training was very powerful for me and also forced me to, how should we say, be very uncomfortable doing things in a learning environment that I don't like to do. But I would say that that's something that I know, has started to cultivate more of this creative expression that I know I bring to teaching and engagement in undergraduate classroom. And I would also say that the risk-taking, especially in larger classes, I would say, is a testament to a lot of the knowledge that was shared with me from those who live on the inside of those particular institutions.
Hello. As I'm reflecting and going back to your comment around the different perspectives with that cartoon, but just everything you said and around the shock jock that you mentioned, back, and I think we're dealing with a different kind of character now, which is those sort of pseudoscientists, the Jordan Petersons of the world, where kids listen to these guys, or Andrew Yates, and they think that they've got some knowledge and some wisdom, and they come to class, and that resistance, that wall of resistance where I'm as I'm reflecting on what you said, it's just that sort of perspective taking is where you need to bring them on the journey, but they don't seem willing at this stage. Often I've experienced, they don't seem willing to come along on the journey, to look at things from different ways, understand how the blue-eyed white woman might be feeling from that cartoon, how the woman of color in that cartoon, do you know what I mean? So how do you bring them along on the journey now with that? How do you get past that wall of resistance?
I think sometimes, and it's very hard to do, and those of you who facilitate workshops as well, workshop facilitation is in some ways, it's instructing as well. It's a different tool or a different way of teaching. I think over the years, Eric, I've understood from making some mistakes and thinking that, oh, this is a great idea, this is gonna be wonderful, the class is gonna love it. What I try to do now is I try to sort of set the tone. So different classes, I think, can handle, or at least you have a pulse for what their capacity is. But in spaces where I feel like, I'm not too sure, I want to set it up. And the ways that I set it up sometimes is I might be doing it. I might be collecting information that speaks to this particular thing. You mentioned Jordan Peterson, and it's hard. That is a very hard subject. But there are Peterson-like comments made in classrooms and online in discussion forums. This is why, spaces are such fragile ecosystems of safety. It's so important, yes, to have these conversations. And when I say it's important to have these conversations, I know that there might be students who are very confused by what I'm saying, because they'll say, well, don't we also have to talk about that stuff that the Petersons and other people are talking about? I know my students love Joe Rogan, right? And to sort of tell them that there's a nuance here, that actually the foundational piece that we have to think about are people's humanities. Sometimes when the conversation starts off by saying, let's look at this in a critical way, always reminding of them of what critical means. Critical doesn't mean you get an opinion and your opinion gets to be said, right? And that's hard for students as well, right? But Senso and D'Angelo talk about this, right to speak discourse in classroom spaces, and this is sort of how I wanted to start my answer to you, is sometimes in certain classes, I start off the term talking about this idea of safe spaces and the right to speak and what that means. and may offer some examples of things that have been going on social media or whatever. And then ask the students about what that means to them and what harms can possibly arise from allowing everyone to speak. And some people say, well, it's silencing. If we want to have this conversation, you want to talk about critical knowledge, then who gets to decide what critical knowledge is? These are conversations that we need to have. These are fights that happen in the classroom space. And I think it's hard to determine that there's a fulfilling answer. But I always come back to, and this is something I've learned from colleagues of mine who have spent more years than I have in these particular settings. If there, from day one, is a culture that, yes, starts with us as the people facilitating things, where people understand what the stakes are in the class, these moments still arise. But what happens is something very beautiful. Students are in the mix with you, shutting it down and speaking back to it. Not necessarily because they think the same things that you do, but they understand that in the practice and in the space of the class, this is something that we've been trying to cultivate. So they want to be a part of it. So it's not a very coherent answer for you. And I think that's why, yes, conferences like these, but why we have to continue talking about the messiness of it, right? So there are no easy answers. And the answers will change, as I'm sure you know, based on who's at the front of the class. There are things that are going to be said, perhaps in rooms that you're in, that you will be able to handle in a certain way that other bodies might not be able to. And that's important too. So imagine we have all of that on our minds and we haven't even gotten to the subject matter yet, right?
Thank you. It was very interesting to hear you talk about going to the prison. I would like to hear a little more about that. What did you learn? I'm excited to know about that.
Yeah, I didn't know a lot about walls to bridges before. A colleague of mine who had taken the training at a different university recommended that I connect with the program, and they called me, which was very, at first, unsettling, but I'm so glad that they did. Most of the people who took the training with me were either educators or those who work in community services and with community, so not just sort of in the office, like on the streets, with community. And they were there for very different reasons, I would say, than I was, but I would say that the outcomes were likely the same for us all. So the inside-out training, if you can imagine, is not like it would be in a regular outside of the institution setting. There are no computers, right? There's no media to show, right? There might be things to read, and those things, for lack of a better word, are policed by those who control and work in the institution. So imagine now, think about the resources or the lack of resources that would be at your disposal to teach 30 people who live outside of the institution about what it means to teach critically and from the margins, and inclusive pedagogical and in inclusive pedagogical ways. So, when I was responding to our colleague over here, this question about, the creative aspect and inclusion and EDI is when you are forced, or you have to, just for 4 days, learn in an environment that is very different from the one that you're used to, you change. you kind of have to change, right? So yeah, that training, as I said, will likely stick with me forever. And I think what's more important is that while the instructors were those who live on the inside of these institutions, the ways in which they were able to talk about knowledge is very different from the ways in which we talk about knowledge that we may pick up in an article or, look here at this comic strip. Their knowledge is the everyday. So they can tell you about hegemony. They'll tell you what that looks like and how it works and who's allowed to go and have an extra hour out and who gets to see, their child on a visit and which CEO controls which courses they can take if they would like to improve upon their knowledge base and think about a future outside of the institution. So you learn a lot about disciplining in those settings, and you learn a lot about how the body is not only your communication vessel, but how your body stands in for so many different things, even before you speak. So that's a little bit more about the Walls to Bridges training. It's not a university course. It's a very, it's a sort of it's a very select thing that they hope that when one goes through the training, they can possibly go back to their institutions, university institutions, community organizations, and come up with programming that, yes, can be for university students, but programming that ultimately can go back into the inside of these institutions and share knowledge, not in a top-down way or in some sort of centralized fashion, but to adopt the strategies and the practices of the sharing knowledge. And I would say the course is also very heavily embedded in indigenous knowledges. So you can use that knowledge and deliver courses in very different epistemological and pedagogical ways.
I think that's very interesting, and I think I'm really interested in doing something like that, just because I'm in the language diversity space, and I go into schools and corporations to help acclimate English language learners. And so I'm thinking, if I should go to the prisons, I need something like that to understand, as you say, it's a different way. And so I'm really interested in doing something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I would happily speak more about it and get you on to some of the resources and info if you would like.
Thank you.